I am Admiral Arun Prakash, former Chief of Naval Staff, and I'm going to speak about India's maritime security and its challenges and opportunities. Many years ago, during a visit to Indonesia, I was shown around an old Russian submarine which had been converted into a museum. After an interesting walk around, I asked my Indonesian guide what the submarine was named. Pasopati came the answer. I must have looked puzzled because he explained it is another name for the Hindu god Shiva. Later, I learned that the motto of the Indonesian Navy was Jal Seva Jaya Mahe, which is Sanskrit for "On the sea, we are glorious." And the crest of their fleet depicted the Brahmastra. My subsequent travels in Southeast Asia revealed many other cultural clues. For example, the state emblems of both Indonesia and Thailand incorporated the Garud, which is a humanoid bird from Hindu mythology. In monuments and paintings all over Indonesia, Thailand and Cambodia, one came across the recurrent theme of Samudra Manthan, with devas and asuras churning the seas for Amrit. Historic monuments at Borobudur in Java, Angkor Wat in Cambodia, and Po Nagar in Vietnam are undoubtedly rooted in Hindu and Buddhist religious beliefs. The point I wish to make is this. While some of us may be aware of our close cultural linkages with Southeast Asia, most others have not given thought to how they were established so far away from home on foreign soil. Obviously, amongst our ancestors, there were many bold and daring sailors who ventured forth across thousands of miles of stormy seas, both to the west and to the east, to carry India's culture, religions, languages, and trade to distant lands. India has a great and ancient maritime tradition which has been forgotten due to a malady that what we sailors call sea blindness. The reason for our sea blindness is that as a nation we've been indifferent to the reading as well as writing of history. The history we do study has been recorded largely by Western historians who dwell only on the maritime exploits of the Greeks, the Phoenicians, and Romans. Rarely in any Western historical account does one find mention of the seafaring skills of ancient Indians. The lone Indian voice in this arena is that of Sardar K.M. Panikkar, statesman, diplomat, and historian. According to him, due to the winds that accompany the cyclic southwest and northeast monsoons, it was the Indian Ocean which saw the first oceanic sailing activity. He clinches his extensive arguments by stating that millenniums before Columbus sailed the Atlantic and Magellan crossed the Pacific, the Indian Ocean had become a thoroughfare of commercial and cultural traffic between the west coast of India and the Middle East. Panikkar also recounts the continuum of trade as well as cultural and religious osmosis by sea from India's east coast to Southeast Asia. Starting with the 4th century BCE Mauryan Empire, he traces Indian maritime activism through the Andhra, Pallava, Pandya, Chalukya, and the Chola dynasties. By the early 11th century, however, Indian maritime power went into rapid decline due to a prolonged naval conflict between the Sumatra-based Srivijaya Empire and the Chola rulers of South India. Thus, in 1498, when the Portuguese adventurer Vasco da Gama dropped anchor in Indian waters, the Sultanate of Delhi was ruled by the Afghan Lodi dynasty, while southern India was divided between the Bahmani and the Vijayanagaram kingdoms. Now, leave alone a navy, none of these rulers possessed the vision to think about the defense of India as a whole. It was only the small flotilla of the Zamorin of Calicut, led by hereditary sea captains of the Kunjali Marakar clan, which put up a fierce fight against the Portuguese and eventually drove them out of Malabar onto Goa. A century later, with the Mughal Empire in decline and the British, French, and the Portuguese jockeying for supremacy, it was the Marathas who clearly foresaw that control of the seas would be critical in the forthcoming conflict. So it was Shivaji who laid the foundations of a Maratha navy in mid-17th century by creating a fleet and by fortifying the Konkan coast. By the time of Shivaji's crowning as Chhatrapati, the Maratha navy had become a sizable force, enabling his legacy to be carried forward by Kanoji Angre, who bore the Maratha title of Sarkhel, which stands for Admiral. Now, Kanoji, with his fleet of native vessels known as Gurabs and Galibats, ceaselessly harassed the British, the Dutch, and Portuguese shipping, scoring many victories against them, both individually and collectively. This led the British historian Charles Kincaid to bestow a unique encomium on Kanoji. Kincaid says, victorious alike over the English, the Dutch, and the Portuguese, Kanoji Angre sailed the Arabian Sea in triumph. Today's Indian Navy is the successor and offspring of the Maratha Navy, from which it should draw its legacy and inspiration. We have preserved the memory of Angre, the Zamorin's, and the Marakkars by naming naval establishments after these maritime warriors. But the point is, how many Indians other than the Navy know about them? Before moving on, I need to point out a few historical realities which often escape our notice. Firstly, the succession of foreign invaders who came overland via the passes of the Hindu Kush stayed on and became assimilated into India's rich cultural fabrics and became Indians. But the Europeans who landed on the shores of peninsular India came only to exploit India and to take our riches home. Secondly, there was a leadership deficit amongst our rulers of the past who lacked not just maritime vision but also the strategic sense to unite against foreign invaders. And lastly, all said and done, it was India's technological backwardness which handicapped us in the conflict against European invaders. Now, these historical lessons must remain etched in our minds because they are the reason that we lost our freedom, we were economically exploited, and are today, regrettably, a third world nation. It was against this backdrop that India's post-independence naval leadership struggled to remind their countrymen that India's security as well as prosperity were dependent on the oceans surrounding our peninsula. They were only partly successful, and the Indian Navy suffered neglect till it demonstrated in the 1971 Bangladesh War that the Navy could be a powerful instrument of the state. The past 2 decades have fortunately witnessed certain key factors combining to bring about an awakening about the need to focus on maritime security. I'll just enumerate them. Firstly, liberalization of the 1990s brought India into the mainstream of the world economy, which had become interlocked by the phenomenon of globalization. Today, trade constitutes over 40% of India's GDP, and more than 95% of this trade is carried by sea. The dependence of India's economy on the free flow of international trade and energy highlights the critical importance of the sea lanes for our progress and our prosperity. Secondly, the upsurge of piracy and hijacking off Somalia in the past decade clearly demonstrated the vulnerability of sea lanes and the serious consequences that disruption of shipping traffic could have on international trade and largely on the world economies. Closer home, the Mumbai terrorist attacks of November 2008 provided a grim reminder to India that its soft maritime underbelly could be neglected only at grave peril to the country. And finally, there was belated realization in India's security circles that China's economic and military rise was likely to fuel its hegemonic ambitions and introduce animosity in relations with neighboring states. China has already provided ample proof of this in the South China Sea, and it's only a matter of time before its naval presence in the Indian Ocean leads to maritime contention. Now let's look at India's maritime interests. India occupies a dominant position in the Indian Ocean region. Jutting 1,000 kilometers into the ocean named after it, the Indian Peninsula has a 7,500 kilometer long coastline containing 200 major and minor ports with an exclusive economic zone of 2.5 million square kilometers. And this zone is rich in food and mineral resources. Located astride vital shipping lanes that run from the Persian Gulf to the Malacca Strait, India's island territories on both seaboards provide strategic maritime outposts. With the Laccadive Group lying across the Arabian Sea shipping lanes and the Andaman and Nicobar Group guarding the mouth of the Malacca Straits. The waters of the Indian Ocean see over 100,000 merchantmen in transit annually, carrying cargo worth over $1 trillion. Both eastbound and westbound shipping passes areas where it is vulnerable to interdiction or interference by states as well as non-state entities like pirates and terrorists and so on. Ensuring the safety of India's ocean sea lanes has to be seen as an international commitment for India. However, the maintenance of good order at sea is also essential for India's own interests, since 1,400 vessels of about 20 million tons fly the Indian flag at sea. These are our merchantmen. In addition, there are almost 200,000 Indian sailors who serve on merchant vessels of other nations. So their safety and their welfare are our responsibility. While the strategic importance of the Indian Ocean is self-evident, less well known are India's rapidly growing interests in the Pacific. Almost 55% of India's trade with the Greater Asia Pacific area transits through South China Sea. ONGC Videsh Limited, OVL for short, is shipping crude oil extracted from its Russian Far East concessions to the Mangalore refinery on our west coast. OVL has also been awarded offshore drilling rights in Vietnam's exclusive economic zone in the South China Sea. But here I must mention that work has been suspended because of China's maritime dispute with Vietnam, and they've put a stop to all exploration therein. In the 1990s, as you perhaps know, India had launched a vigorous Look East policy in its quest for economic access to ASEAN nations. This was upgraded to Act East, and it has seen India establishing close rapport with Pacific nations such as Japan, Australia, Vietnam and Indonesia. Today, India's trading links, investment and a large diaspora span an arc extending from Siberia in the east to Africa and Central Asia in the west. Any attempts to dominate waters of the Indian or Pacific Oceans would represent a grave threat to India's vital interests. As far back as 1890, American maritime strategist Admiral Mahan, acknowledging the importance of the Indian and Pacific Oceans, had described them as future hinges of the world's geopolitical destiny. In Mahan's vision, control of this region could empower a maritime nation to influence political developments right across Asia and Europe. 100 years later, we find that the older expression Asia-Pacific has been replaced by a new term, the Indo-Pacific. This recognizes the coupling of these two oceans by vital sea lanes. It also acknowledges some new realities such as the rising China and India and their overlapping interests, as well as India's emerging relationships with many Pacific nations. Coming to a subject that is not often spoken of, which is maritime diplomacy. Countries in India's immediate neighborhood, many of them island nations, seek maritime security, sometimes through direct naval presence, but more often through requests for material aid, training assistance, and advice. Now, responding to such requests in a reasonable time frame requires close coordination between the Navy, the Ministry of Defence, and the Ministry of External Affairs, and I must say that unfortunately it doesn't happen very often. As one of the biggest Indo-Pacific nations, it is essential that India does not convey that maritime security is a zero-sum game. Assurance of security and prosperity only for some nations would be counterproductive, because it could foster anxiety amongst others and lead to tension and instability. So, inclusivity is vital, and Indian Prime Minister encapsulated this thought when he announced during a 2015 visit to Mauritius. He said, "We seek a future for the Indian Ocean that ensures security and growth for all in the region." This phrase, security and growth for all, forms the acronym SAGAR, S-A-G-A-R. Now, against this backdrop, India's recent outreach and maritime agreements with Indian Ocean nations, as well as many Persian Gulf and African states, have raised hopes that India is at last strengthening its maritime posture in the Indian Ocean region. Similarly, participation in the emerging US, Japan, Australia, India quadrilateral security dialogue is being seen as steps in the right direction for ensuring peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific region. Now, whether all these measures herald a renewed impetus to India's maritime outreach will depend on whether they are random actions or components of a carefully thought through overarching national maritime strategy, and I'll come back to this a little later. Let's look at China's maritime rise. China, more than India, is reliant on the seas for its economic growth and has crafted a grand strategy based on a powerful navy to protect its seaborne trade and energy. In the early years of the last decade, China started making infrastructure investments in Indian Ocean ports as well as part of a coherent long-term strategy. By acquiring maritime footholds in Pakistan, Seychelles, Sri Lanka, Myanmar and Bangladesh, China was creating a network of facilities along its vulnerable sea lanes, which came to be known as the String of Pearls. With the subsequent launch of the Belt and Road Initiative, known as BRI, China has embarked on a far more ambitious maritime agenda that will create a seamless swath of geopolitical influence right across the Indo-Pacific. Many other manifestations of China's unfolding grand strategy are emerging. Particularly worrisome is India's encirclement by a growing ring of Chinese power and influence. To the north, garrisons, airfields and missile sites linked by modern road-rail networks underpin China's dominant posture in the Tibetan Plateau. To our east, China's Yunnan province will gain access to the Bay of Bengal via rail, highway and pipelines linking it to the deep-water port built by China at Kyakpu in Myanmar. A parallel endeavour on India's western flank, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC, will create access to the Arabian Sea from Xinjiang to the Pakistani port of Gwadar via Gilgit-Baltistan. This violates Indian sovereignty because it runs through Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. CPEC forms the bedrock of China's South Asian strategy with a commitment of over $60 billion. Going further west, China has set up its first overseas military base at Djibouti on the Bab al-Mandab. To our south, China has built a new harbour in Hambantota in Sri Lanka and modernized the port of Colombo. All three ports could provide bases for PLA Navy ships and submarines which are deployed in the Indian Ocean sometime in the future. But at this point, it is important to take note of the all-round growth of China's maritime power. Let's take a closer look at it. Now, ever since Xi Jinping designated the maritime domain as an essential building block of his China dream, the Communist Party has brought sharp focus on it and overseen the systematic build-up of each element of national maritime power. The results have been truly striking. China is today the world leader in shipbuilding, and its 5,000 ship-strong merchant marine ranks as number one in the world. It also owns the largest number of Coast Guard vessels that protect the world's biggest fishing fleet. It is noteworthy that China's seagoing fishing fleet is viewed in strategic terms as a guarantor of national food security and marine economy. Chinese shipyards are rapidly adding to its fleet of modern destroyers, frigates, diesel submarines and logistics support ships. Its force of home-built nuclear submarines has been operationally deployed, and its first aircraft carrier is already at sea with more on the way. In a few years, the PLA Navy will overtake the US Navy, certainly in numbers, and be second, perhaps only in capability. Pakistan, enlisted by China as a cat's paw, constitutes an integral part of the latter's foreign and security policies. In any conflict with India, the Sino-Pak axis will ensure that a second military front is opened for the other party's benefit. The deployment of PLA Navy submarines in the Indian Ocean that commenced in 2013-14 was a clear indication that China seeks to not only gain strategic superiority across the Himalayas, but also to establish maritime dominance in the Indian Ocean at our doorstep. What is India's maritime blueprint? Let me provide a small insight into the Indian Navy's plans for capability accretion over the next couple of decades or so. As our decision makers began to acknowledge the Navy's role in state policy, a clear-cut roadmap became necessary to synergize our national maritime endeavours. During the past decade, the Navy has promulgated a maritime doctrine as well as a maritime strategy with the aims of enlightening the political and security establishments about maritime security issues and about the utility of naval forces in peace as well as in war. Now, despite the maritime awakening that I had mentioned earlier, the Navy's share of the defense budget has unfortunately and traditionally remained well behind its sister services. In the 1980s, it had crept up very slowly from 6% to about 12%, and it reached an all-time high of 18% in 2012. But this year, it has progressively fallen again to 13%, which is a low, and the slowing economy does not give us much hope for the near future. Due to this, the Navy's earlier plans to reach the 200-ship mark by 2030 have reportedly been scaled back. While fiscal stringency demands a cautious approach, the approvals which have already been accorded by the government will enable the Navy to add about 50 ships in the next decade or so. By the mid-2030s, we should have a fleet of about 175 warships, which will still place the Indian Navy among the top ranks of modern navies worldwide. Let's take a look at a few details of the Navy's future plans. Now, one of the most significant decisions taken by the Navy's leadership way back in the 60s was to initiate indigenous warship design and construction. Today, the Navy's stature as well as operational capability owe much to the fact that its ships are largely designed and built in India. There are 4 shipyards belonging to the MOD, 1 each in Mumbai, Kolkata, Goa and Visakhapatnam, which are devoted to building naval vessels. They have over the past 5 decades constructed over 100 modern warships. And these include destroyers, frigates, submarines, corvettes, landing ships, tankers and patrol vessels, etc. A 5th shipyard in Cochin belongs to the Ministry of Shipping and has been engaged in building India's first aircraft carrier. In addition to all these, a special facility has also been created in Visakhapatnam for building nuclear submarines, and I'll talk about that a little later. While the Navy derives great pride and satisfaction from the indigenous warship building capability nurtured by it, there are a few areas of major concern. Firstly, a high proportion of the weapons, sensors and machinery that goes into these ships is imported and creates undesirable dependency on foreign sources. And lastly, the exclusion of the private sector from defense production has definitely hindered the progress of our warship building industry, but this policy seems to be undergoing change. In the case of submarine construction, India has lagged well behind China as well as Pakistan, and our force is at a low of just 13 submarines against China's more than 70 and Pakistan's 15 submarines. In the 1980s, India had signed a contract for acquisition of 6 submarines of German design. 2 were to be constructed in Germany and the other 4 in India. But sadly, after construction of just 2 boats in Mumbai, the program was killed in 1990 on account of a corruption scandal. So after a lapse of 15 years, we've started another project to undertake construction of 6 French-designed submarines which are being built in Mumbai. The first 2 of these have already been delivered to the Navy and 4 more will follow. The Indian Navy in actual fact needs to create a force of about at least 30 submarines to meet its operational commitments, and the government needs to address this lacuna with a sense of urgency. Coming to aircraft carriers, the Indian Navy acquired INS Vikrant in 1961, and for the past 6 decades, the aircraft carrier has formed the centerpiece of Navy's doctrine and strategy. After Vikrant, we acquired the Virat from Britain, and since 2013, we've been operating INS Vikramaditya, a former Russian carrier. The construction of an indigenous aircraft carrier to be named INS Vikrant commenced in 2009 in Cochin, and it may be ready for delivery by 2022. For many years, the Navy has also been contemplating plans for the construction of a larger carrier, but its fate hangs in balance for want of a political decision and for funding support. Now here it's worth mentioning that China has been operating a former Russian aircraft carrier just like us since 2012, and its first indigenously built carrier went to sea in 2018. A substantial carrier building program is reported to be underway in China, and it is believed that the PLA Navy intends to operate as many as 6 aircraft carriers by 2050. And some of them will certainly be based in the Indian Ocean. China is also producing its own carrier-based aircraft, which brings me to our own naval aviation. Now, intense maritime activity in the Indian Ocean and the huge area that has to be kept under surveillance requires substantial maritime reconnaissance and anti-submarine warfare capabilities. The Navy has evolved a multi-layered surveillance capability with a mix of long-range and medium-range aircraft as well as unmanned aerial vehicles, which are known as UAVs. A new squadron of Boeing P-8 patrol and anti-submarine warfare aircraft has been commissioned recently, and eventually we expect to have a force of 35 to 40 aircraft of this variety to meet the demands of surveillance. Navy's current carrier-borne fighter is the Russian MiG-29K, which operates from the Vikramaditya and may also fly from the next carrier that we are planning to build. The indigenous light combat aircraft known as Tejas fighter is likely to undergo further development and may be inducted on board our future aircraft carriers. Today, every sizable warship in the Navy is equipped with one or more helicopters, which are used for anti-submarine warfare and many other roles. The service is currently in the process of selecting a medium-sized helicopter in the international market to replace our older machines. Which brings me to our nuclear submarines, which I mentioned earlier. Now, strategic nuclear deterrence is an important mission of the Navy. A nuclear-propelled submarine armed with nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles, once it dives underwater, is more or less invisible, and therefore we assume that it is invulnerable. Such submarines, which are called SSBNs by the Navy, provide a far greater assurance of retaliation after an enemy nuclear strike when compared to land-based missiles as well as aircraft. And that's the reason why India has sought to create the underwater leg of its nuclear triad. INS Arihant, India's first home-built nuclear submarine, undertook its first deterrent patrol in 2018. Now, while this was a significant step in enhancing the credibility of our nuclear deterrent, the ballistic missile which is currently carried by the Arihant has a relatively limited range. Construction is well underway of two more SSBNs which will carry missiles of intercontinental range, and this will provide India a full-fledged underwater nuclear deterrent. There is a second type of nuclear-powered submarine also which carries only torpedoes and anti-ship missiles, and this is called an attack submarine or SSN. A Russian submarine of this type was taken on lease in 2012 and we've renamed it INS Chakra. Its roles include protecting the aircraft carrier force, hunting enemy submarines, and interdicting enemy shipping. There are also plans to build several of these SSN types in Visakhapatnam in the near future. Now, as I approach the end of my talk, let me highlight some vital areas of concern in the overall domain of maritime security which require everybody's attention. Unlike their Chinese counterparts, India's decision makers have failed to comprehend that the Navy by itself constitutes just one component of the country's maritime capability. And India has unfortunately overlooked many of the remaining elements, and its maritime power will remain hollow unless we address these voids. Our ports and infrastructure remain relatively backward. Our shipbuilding industry is languishing, and the merchant fleet is stagnant in numbers. We lack an ocean-going fishing fleet. Our inland waterways are neglected, and exploitation of the seabed is yet to start in any seriousness. Now, most of these factors which I have mentioned are constituents of what is now known as the blue economy. India's failure to focus on maritime capability building represents not just a huge economic missed opportunity, but also undermines its maritime power in the long term. We need to emulate China, which is, as I pointed out earlier, has acquired all elements of maritime power and is rapidly developing its blue economy. The Indian Navy's maritime doctrines and strategies, as well as initiatives like Sagar abroad and Sagar Mala at home, will lack logic and coherence unless backed by a comprehensive national strategy for maritime security. The faithful implementation of this strategy will create urgently needed capacities that will not only benefit our economy, but also reinforce maritime security. Before I close, I want to leave one final reminder, which is for our youth. We will only become a true maritime nation when we can revive our ancient seafaring skills and the maritime tradition that have lain dormant for 1,000 years at least. The Indian Navy has been doing its utmost, but this revival will only happen when our young people take to the seas and reclaim their maritime heritage. In this context, let me mention 3 events that all Indians need to be made aware of. In 2009-10, a naval officer, Captain Dilip Donde by name, became the first Indian to circumnavigate the globe solo, single-handed in a boat called Mahadei, which was built in Goa. Donde made 4 stops during this 9-month-long voyage. 3 years later, he was followed by another naval officer, Lieutenant Commander Abhilash Tomi, who also sailed around the world solo in 151 days, but this time without stopping anywhere, non-stop around the world. But our crowning glory came during 2017-18, when a crew of 6 young women naval officers, led by Lieutenant Commander Vartika Joshi, circumnavigated the globe in a grueling 8-month-long voyage. These epic ocean voyages were not just a display of tremendous human courage, endurance and fortitude, but also demonstrated that the seafaring skills of Indians were well and alive. This came as a surprise to many of us, because we as Indians had forgotten that amongst our forefathers were bold and enterprising sailors, merchants and religious teachers who had crossed the seas not to colonize and exploit, but to propagate India's culture and civilizational values abroad. So amongst us, we still have heirs of the Zamarins, the Marakars and the Angres, and one hopes that they will inspire many other Indian youth to follow in their wakes. I started with a reminder of India's glorious maritime past and of the weaknesses that crept in subsequently, resulting in domination by foreign powers. India's maritime security suffered neglect for generations because sea blindness and a continental outlook led our ancestors to believe that the mighty Himalayas would safeguard them. Today's maritime environment is more hazardous and our dependence on the seas more critical than it has ever been in history. Recent developments on our land borders, as well as in the larger Indo-Pacific, have served to restore sharp focus on the maritime domain. The Navy can play the role of a game changer. But for this to happen, India must accord due importance to the demands of maritime security, not only by acquiring all the attributes of maritime power, but also by reviving our maritime heritage and enhancing the level of maritime consciousness amongst India's politico-bureaucratic elite. Thank you. Jai Hind. Okay, we were fortunate in having an early naval leadership in the 50s and 60s, which did foresee this issue that you can build the armed forces, you can create armed forces, but for them to be truly national, you got to build the hardware also in India. And somehow they resolutely pushed this proposal with the government, and we started building warships under license from Britain as far back as 1960s. And once that started going, then the government also, confidence was built up in the system. And now today our Indian warship building industry is very mature. And as I mentioned in my talk, we can build anything from a patrol boat to a destroyer to a submarine to something as big as an aircraft carrier. So we have that capability. The government has backed us up, and in that way the Navy is very proud that we are different from the Army and the Air Force. They wanted hardware now, and that can only be done if you import it. The Navy agreed to wait. We also accepted that mistakes will be made while we design and build our own ships and so on. So with all this tolerance built in, we got off to a good start. Unfortunate part is that we can build a ship, we can design a ship, we can build it, we can integrate the electronics and so on, but the many of the systems that go inside the ship, and I'll count them for you: the engines, whether it's diesel, gas turbine, nuclear, or even steam engines, the gun, the missiles, the radar, the torpedoes, all of these come from abroad. And the other issue is that had we allowed the private sector to enter the arms market, they would have invested in R&D, they would have brought better techniques, better work culture, and perhaps we may not have been in this embarrassing position that we find ourselves today in. Yeah, theatre command means this whole issue revolves around something called jointness, that in today's environment, No country in the world, no country of significance will fight a war where each service acts on its own, has its own plans, has its own, which is where we are today. It is unrealistic, it is wasteful of money, and in war it could be disastrous. So the idea is to become joint. All three services must plan jointly, operate jointly, learn how to fight together. So this can only happen when you have a single man on top, a single point advisor to the government. He is called the Chief of Defence Staff. And once we have a Chief of Defence Staff, he will create this environment where the services work jointly. And then the proof of the pudding will be when we can create a theatre command where it is required. Like today in the Andaman Nicobars, we've got a theatre command. Army, Navy, Air Force are under a single commander. All plans are joint, they work together, they fight together. So similarly, theatre commands will have to come and will come only once you put in place a Chief of Defence Staff and start a program of making the services joint, planning, and we are wasting money. Each service buys its own hardware, it's a waste of money. When you have a joint organization, you will save on money, you will be more efficient, and you will be certainly far, far more combat worthy as a joint force. Yeah, okay, so the problem was twofold, that the people, the rulers of those eras, maybe 14th, 15th, 16th century when the Europeans started coming, they didn't have a maritime vision, and yet there's an exception that Shivaji realized that if he was going to combat the Europeans and the Siddhis who were troubling him, he had to have a navy. So he founded a navy. That navy was based on country craft called gurabs and galibats. They were rowed or had sails, very rudimentary armament. And the irony is that almost at the same time there was a Parsi family called the Wadias who started a shipbuilding industry in Mumbai. And the Wadias were building ships for the East India Company, which could travel across the seas, and they were also building warships for the Royal Navy. So if Indians could build ships for the British, if Indians built warships for themselves and looked a little more closely at capability like guns and cannons and so on, all this was not inevitable. If we had fought off they were small countries, Portuguese were tiny little countries, so was UK. Had we fought them off, we would not have been in the situation that we are today. Answers that. Yes. No, the best example of private partnership is the INS Arihant, our first nuclear submarine, has been built jointly between the Navy and L&T. So the private sector has a lot to contribute, provided we allow them to take part. So far, the defence bureaucracy has actively pushed the private sector away, in spite of making noises that we are trying to bring them in. In fact, they've been kept out. So I think the sooner they come into this sector, the better for everybody.